Hello, everybody, and welcome to our conversation in our series on our world today, the Unionist perspective. Today, we're looking at a couple of topics that we believe speak to a theme around trust in leadership and how the news articles that have popped up over the last week start to demonstrate that theme, and also to unpack the underlying sense of what we believe that trust could potentially look like, and maybe also what that distrust looks like. And so one of the things that stood out has just been a recent story around South Africa apparently supplying arms to Russia in this Russia-Ukraine conflict. And the story was broken in news probably just over a week ago from the US ambassador to South Africa. And I don't remember his name right now, but in essence, he made the claim that because a Russian ship was docked in one of the ports in South Africa, in one of the military ports in South Africa, that there was an assumption that there was an arms supply to Russia during as part of this conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. And the relationship between South Africa and Russia has kind of been quite highlighted over the last few months from the perspective that South Africa has chosen to adopt a non-participative stance, so the non-aligned stance, which is the party line of the governing party in South Africa. But the relationship probably stems back a lot longer because Russia actually supplied arms to the governing party during their fight to end racial segregation in South Africa. So, and that's probably a longer than 30-year relationship. So it's always been called into question in terms of where does South Africa's allegiance lie under these conflicts, within this conflict situation. And then South Africa adopting the stance of being non-aligned has brought their lack of position, and also the stance that South Africa is trying to argue for a non-violent end to this conflict. So it's all been brought into question. And then, of course, this breaking news around the supposed arms supply brought it further into question, which resulted in quite a sharp fall in the currency of the country. Only then to have newspaper articles a week later saying, well, you know, there's now a situation where this US ambassador, has backtracked and apologized for the assertion. Although when you read the articles relating to this supposed apology, it doesn't really speak to much of an apology. So one of the responses from a South African point of view is that the president has decided to launch an inquiry into the situation. But having said that, the situation has caused a bigger level of distrust of this governing party, because there have been so many instances where political promises have been made that have not been followed through. And there's a sentiment in South Africa amongst the majority of the population that this governing party is not governing as well as it needs to, and in fact is probably also just as corrupt as could potentially be considered almost a mafia within the political system. And so there's a lot of distrust in party politics at the moment. And we have quite a few parties in politics, lots of little factions that for me almost seed a divide amongst the nation. amongst the voting population. So there isn't a strong opposition to the governing party unless there are coalitions amongst all these smaller parties. The only other big party that would probably be one of the stronger oppositions, but not by a big margin, is now also questioning some of the policies that the ruling or governing party have now decided to implement in terms of employment equity across various provinces and those kind of things. So a lot of this is happening at a time that's leading up to the election in 2024, which is also causing a lot more uncertainty from a population point of view, but also from an investor point of view. So there's a lot of concern around the economic impact of some of the things that have happened over the last few months and years. So yeah, just potentially putting it in perspective. And then of course, also the rolling blackouts that have been happening since probably the middle of the 2000s that essentially should have been resolved in some measure or another, have now started, well, have resulted in, for the last probably 10 years or more, scheduled blackouts where parts of provinces and parts of cities and parts of areas are scheduled to switch off electricity so that the grid doesn't collapse. So there's a lot happening in terms of what looks like a very dusty chessboard. And we also probably have a lot happening underneath the chessboard that we don't necessarily have a sense of, which is literally fueling significant levels of distrust at a political leadership level. So yeah, I'm kind of giving you guys a very high level rundown of some of the nuances that might not come through in these newspaper articles, but that you can see that they all start to stack up and literally continuously contribute to the level of distrust of the governing party. But also it also probably has a sense of debilitating some people in terms of politically choosing to have a stable life and a stable country. So, you know, the thing about the choice is that there's a sentiment that people still fear that not to vote for this governing party is to potentially allow racial segregation back into the country, which is highly unlikely to happen. We are literally 27 years down the line. Yes, definitely a newer democracy, but still 27 years down the line in a democratic country. So it would be very difficult to re-establish racial boundaries in a country that has worked so hard to actually, well, literally uproot it. And yes, the undercurrent is obviously still there, as we know with most countries, that it's not an overnight change. And given that it's a relatively newer democracy, there's probably going to be continuous teething problems because sometimes the lessons have not been learned. And sometimes the lessons are being repeated, but in a much more underhanded way, but that have the same economic impact on various racial groups. So, you know, that still has that impact. And I think given our previous conversations, even just in terms of how the rights of Black people that still don't seem to be quite entrenched, and how certain population groups probably still are marginalized, it just feels like there's, with this governing party, a lot of energy going into deflecting from the core of the issue, which is that they are not governing well, which is what the South African population and public really don't feel confident in, which is what is fueling the distrust.
So there's something you mentioned about policies not being applied, and that fueled the level of distrust of the people. And it almost feels like, and we're going to compare it to Erdogan later in the discussion, but it almost feels like what people hate the most is apathy rather than doing something, whether it's like morally considered as good or bad. And so it feels like this apathy is feeling worse from the country of South Africa than anything that they can try to do but have not succeeded to do. It almost feels like there's also apathy in the different parties. It's like they want for the democracy to change, but it almost feels like because the government seems to not be doing anything, they almost don't have anything to counter, which is kind of weird in a democracy. And so the sense of apathy is also felt in the international situation with Russia. And like, it feels like South Africa is directly, what is brought up to my mind is that being silent is being complacent. Yeah, we usually hear this in like several situations, and I think it's definitely true for politics as well. And so it feels like being silent in this case has resulted in a very quick spiritual response in order to it feels like it wants to make South Africa move. So it doesn't feel like it's a bad thing in essence if it's going to shake up the country. It's like, okay, like we need to wake up. Apathy is not status quo, or maybe, but it's not going to get us anywhere. Like the situation is good, but just because we have fear doesn't mean that we need to stay there. And that's the first thing that came to my mind in reading the article, and the first thing that came to my mind when I started explaining the situation. So I don't know how you guys feel about it, but it almost feels like the way you said in our chat that South Africa is almost like forced to make a stance, feels to me like it's related to a general energy of like, make a stance, make a move, you know?
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I think it's been a culmination of literally politics of non-involvement, which in this day and age cannot be politics of non-involvement. There is always going to be some level of alignment. There's always going to be a requirement to fulfill our obligations to certain international laws and international processes. And so, you know, even just the simplicity of our government saying, well, we're not sure if, since there's been an order for Vladimir Putin's arrest, and I don't know if it was the United Nations or one of those overarching bodies saying that he's a war criminal, and therefore any aligned country should actually act to arrest him, and the government still inviting him to South Africa and then saying, well, actually, we're not sure if we're going to arrest him or not, starts to actually make you wonder, well, what politics are you practicing? What's the underlying alignment here that is not in the public eye, that is not surfacing? So again, it always brings up the question of, can we trust you? Are you trustworthy? Are you not acting because you're aligned, or are you not acting because you're not interested? And if you're not interested in being a global citizen, you have a bigger problem.
Yeah, that is interesting. I saw that like South Africa is part of the International Criminal Court. That's like the group that issued that warrant for him. So they are part of it, but yeah, I saw that the South African president was saying that, I don't know the details of that. Maybe you can fill in, but like he was saying something like, the ICC has like double standards. I'm not sure what he means by that, because this is the just first part of me hearing about it. But he's like, I don't know if we want to like issue the arrest warrant, you know? And yeah, I don't know. It feels like, I don't know. I feel like the heart of it is probably like, South Africa isn't sure how to navigate the fact that like the US designated the ANC as a terrorist group in the past. And Nelson Mandela, I learned this last night, that the US said Nelson Mandela was a terrorist until 2008. Until 2008. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. And I don't know all the details. All I know is that is crazy, because if anything, you would call the apartheid government terrorists, because like they did all kinds of terroristic acts toward people resisting apartheid. So I was like, US, why are you doing that? And regardless of why, like, why don't you just like apologize and like become more open about that, you know, and just be nice and apologize about that or something? Because I'm like, it's clearly still causing problems in your relationship with South Africa. And I feel like that's like a lot of what it's about. But yeah, let me know what you feel about that. Because I feel like it's kind of like, well, you can either go toward like Russia or China, or like the US and the Europe and everything, Europe. And they're kind of being like, okay, well, if not them, then let's do Russia. And I'm just like, no, but is this really a good option though? So, okay.
I think you're pointing to something very interesting, is that even though it's been 20 something years, it feels like there are still like some patterns playing out. Because why else, in a spiritual sense at least, a US ambassador would say that from a country while being here? It still boggles my mind. I think we haven't talked about it yet, but it's like, what? And maybe to some degree, South Africa is like feeling that they have to, they're still in that mentality of like, well, we're not supported by other countries. And sometimes, it's part of like the international governance, but sometimes it still feels like a few African countries that are like, well, how are we going to get placed in this world? What is our place in the world? And maybe that's what the US is mirroring to them. And obviously the US has their fair share of like what they have too. But yeah, I thought it's definitely a pattern playing out. So it's definitely pointing to something to heal simply. But if you're in that stance of like, ugh, we've got something good, we don't want to lose it, so we're not going to move anywhere. Should we move left? Should we move right? Obviously, we're not going to look at the pattern. So yeah, South Africa start to make a move, but yeah, it's so spiritual. Yeah.
That stood out to me too. When I was reading the article, the first one that Granville posted, was the actions of the US ambassador, because I thought that was a bit odd too. Like, going back to like leadership, I feel like, I mean, I've never been an ambassador, but I'm just assuming the role in that is to foster like positive relations and, you know, peace, communication between, you know, your country of origin and, you know, whatever country you're assigned to. And so it was just odd, back to what you were saying, Irene, and like, why not, you know, talk about this maybe in private, like come to some sort of, you know, mutual solution, or just have some sort of conversation. I was not aware that Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist in the US, you know, until fairly recently. So that is a shocker to me. And, but it, I mean, it doesn't surprise me. I just, you know, there's definitely some healing to do. And I think since the US ambassador thing stood out to me, I feel like a lot of it is about how, because I feel like this is a pattern too, like going back to just like repeating patterns or patterns that seem to persist through time, is this attitude that America takes to like the rest of the world. And I feel like there's certain countries, especially countries that maybe were colonized before or had some sort of like Western influence, where the way they're treated is still kind of like disrespectful and maybe not like an equal playing field. Because let's say it was an ambassador for like Germany or, you know, the UK or some country that seems to have like more friendly relations with the US. I feel like maybe the behavior would be different. Maybe it wouldn't be just like a flat out, like in public, accusing the country that you're technically, I feel like, supposed to be serving in a way, of doing something, you know, whether it's true or not. I feel like the trust that is required in that relationship, you're kind of like dismantling that trust almost.
Back to back, I have to agree with you, but it's like, yeah, there's this level of disrespect, or it even happens with Japan sometimes, because Japan was like occupied by the Americans to kind of democratize the country. And it's like the West is like, well, the internet of Western countries is not going to get outraged about this, so they effed up, but we're swiftly not going to talk about it. So yeah, and there's this level of like, oh yeah, you guys, we're allies, but yeah, sometimes I can still show you that I'm a little bit better and do what I want with you. And so there's definitely a level of putting boundaries. And I think I remember Japan is like starting to put boundaries. It's like, well, you guys, who transformed me, who like kind of like on my culture, and I'm trying to still exist in that mold, like, and now we're allies, but still. And so there's so much to heal about like colonization for some countries. It really ended like the end of the 70s, beginning of 80s. So obviously there is still a lot to do. But yeah, there's that level of like disrespect and like lack of boundaries that feels a little bit icky. And there's definitely like we need to I'm making the choice in my heart like to say, okay, I respect myself enough so this doesn't happen anymore. But like each person in each country has to make my choice too. Okay, we are equal. We're different, but equal. Let's put the past in the past and start upholding new boundaries and new spiritual patterns. And so, yeah, it's very interesting what you said, because I definitely feel it too. It's not something that you're imagining at all, but yeah.
Yeah, that's why I commented about being confused, because I'm like, do you understand your role as an ambassador? Do you understand the duty, sort of, and like, you know, what it requires? And so I was just like, man, this person is not well suited. I don't know him, but just from that one article, yeah, it was. And regardless of what South Africa's doing, like, it's just, just based on like being an ambassador, it was a weird way to go.
Yeah, I thought someone put it up to him to say that or something. I don't know why he would do it so undiplomatically.
Yeah.
But I also had a feeling of stagnancy energy when it came to South Africa as well as Turkey. I don't know if you guys were feeling stagnancy as well. I brought it back to Turkey because I feel like the election is going into a place where they are kind of unsure of whether to move on to another leader or continue with this leader. Probably the earthquake kind of shook them up because of that, and they want to cling to this leader. But that's how I was feeling. Yeah.
It's
I'm
very
laughing because you said the earthquake shook them up. I was like, oh, well, nice pun there.
Yeah, I felt that. They were like, I don't know what to do now.
Oh my
Oops.
goodness.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like I was kind of surprised, to be honest, on a personal level. I thought that there are definitely some media that are saying that people are enraged that the Turkey has not done anything in the past to prevent this, even though they're on a really like tectonic territory, and is doing nothing right now to kind of make things better. I don't know if it was the class of like, we had this article come up about even the wealthiest people were not immune to this, even though their apartment were supposed to be in the norm for upgrades. So I don't know if it was the class of people that were felt very like kind of betrayed by the fact that they paid the price to have security and they didn't get it in the end.
That's a really good question.
Yeah, it's like a feeling that there was a dissonance in the promise of the relationship and what they got. And so I don't know if it's just this class that was enraged, and obviously because it was kind of dramatic and the West is not agreeing with Turkey, it was put up in the media more, and the West is like more maybe complacent or thinks like there's nothing better elsewhere for them. Oh, my heart felt a little tight while doing this, so maybe there's something here. So they just put up with it, and that's why his re-election is feeling so imminent, because like on the first tour he got like 88%. Where do we see that? Where? It's like, with all the crap that is said in the past few years, like why? And that's why it was surprising to me. But maybe we don't know. We know that what the intellectual class is thinking about Turkey, but we don't know what the rest of the people are feeling and thinking, because we don't hear their voice enough. It's not put up by media enough. So there's probably a lot to unpack there, and we probably won't know everything that is going on since we don't have all the resources to know. But we can definitely feel into it and see why they're making the choice to re-elect him. So yeah.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that stood out with Sage's comment was also just in terms of South Africa's history. The ANC was actually at some point seen to be a violent aggressor in South Africa. And so with that, there would have been some international alignment to the government at the time, which would have made the ANC in South Africa viewed as a terrorist organization, and therefore it's not surprising that at some point in our history, Nelson Mandela was termed a terrorist. But we also need to remember that it ended quite early into, quite quickly after his release. But also, I mean, just our political history has always been one of exceptional violence. And so the stance of stagnancy seems to be a choice not to pursue violence, but in not pursuing violence, there also seems to be this apathy to act. So there's a lot of conversation, there's a lot of debate, but there's no real movement. And so you have somebody like the Democratic Alliance, which is what was a spin-off of the previous National Party that was the governing party at the time during the apartheid years, that have now reformed themselves, being the biggest opposition to the ANC at the moment, but also saying that they're not significant opposition given that South Africa is a majority black person country, which means the constituency votes more in favor of the ANC because the majority of people have been disadvantaged for such a long time under apartheid laws. So there's definitely a level of support because this party took great pain to have the politics shift and to move the country into democracy, even if it was through significant violence. But having said that, there's also this beholdenness of Black people to this party, even though this party is now the result of some of the economic, political, and social challenges in the country. So, it's kind of like almost having Stockholm syndrome. You fall in love with the person that rescued you, but they then turn into the abuser and you remain in love with them. And I feel like there's a little bit of a consciousness of Stockholm syndrome as opposed to literally understanding what the purpose of government is in our country. Because if we were to be really honest and really clear and break it down to its rudimentary form, government are the employees of a nation. They are not the rulers of a nation. They are not monarchs. Their word is not sacrosanct. They are actually employees of a nation. Therefore, they should be serving the nation and ensuring that the nation has security, has a level of just a decent standard of living, has decent policies that ensure that there's equal opportunities, and all those kind of things. If we had to literally be very, very crass about government's purpose, their job is to work for us. We pay tax to employ them so that they can work for us. And how often do we find that in countries, government does not work for the people, regardless of whether it's a democracy or not?
I don't know if this relates to Turkey, but I feel like what Irene was saying kind of stuck with me. And, as you were talking, Granville, there might be some connection there, especially with like why people continue to vote for Erdogan, and he's been leader for like 20 some odd years or something. But I was reading a few other articles, and apparently there's been, the reason why he grew in popularity was because there's a large section of the Turkish population that basically kind of feels marginalized because they're Muslim. And, when there was or at least they're like, I wouldn't say Orthodox, but, they cover themselves. They're very religious, very non-secular. And, Turkey kind of went through a secular westernized shift when Ataturk came into power. And so I don't this was new information for me, and because I don't feel like they talk about this a lot, but there's a whole population of the country that actually feels like they are now being seen because there was like laws in Turkey before where you couldn't enter universities or places of business with a hair covering. And so like a lot of women were complaining about being marginalized during that time period. But then once Recep Tayyip became president, that kind of shifted. And so I almost feel like, and I don't know how they feel about him currently, because there's been a lot of issues, the economy. I mean, there's been a lot of things, like I guess he's helped certain things, but in other areas, hasn't been, like tourism, I guess, has been going down too in Turkey. And so there's been a lot of like economic losses. But I wonder if that is what's driving it, or if there's like a genuine desire to have that leadership, or if it's more so what Granville was saying in terms of, they voted for him initially because there was a desire, but then now they just feel like they're kind of stuck because that's what it's been for so long. And maybe they're scared of change. Maybe there's this fear of the unknown, because I guess his opponent wants to come back and like make the country more secular, like it was before. And so it definitely feels convoluted. Like there's a lot of moving parts, just like with South Africa. There's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that at all. But it's true. I feel like the westernized version of Turkey is generally more visible and accepted. At least in Europe, I've always seen this until it shifted in like 2015, obviously. But yeah, maybe that's what people are supporting, like being accepted, finally. That explains why he would say something about Finland when an extremist burned the Quran. He wasn't saying it for the international community, he was saying it for his own people to ensure maybe his re-election. That's so interesting. Like, we're having the response to this like months afterwards, but yeah, it's so weird. And yeah, it kind of, the fact that his opponents want to come back to a secular kind of model kind of stinks too. So maybe people are saying like, well, we survived well enough under Erdogan, so maybe we could stay there because we don't want, I don't feel they want the secular thing at all. So that might be a thing too. But yeah, thank you for these precisions.
Yeah, you're welcome. I feel like it's just an overall theme in the Middle East. There's like this conflict between secularism and just being totally, extremely like religious, dogmatic, and because Iran's the same way, when the Shah was in power, it was similar to Turkey. There were very Europeanized, even like parts of the language changed. He incorporated some French words into Farsi just to make it more like, European, westernized, kind of like bring their standing up in the world. And now it's like the total opposite. Like it's shifted to the other extreme. And it was the same thing. Like the reason why there was a coup in Iran is because people felt like, I mean, it was influenced by outside forces, but there was a faction of people that felt like the Shah did not see them because of their religious beliefs. And they almost felt like, very similar to what people are saying in Turkey, they did not feel supported. And so I feel like it's almost like finding a balance between who you are as a country, and like claiming all parts of yourself instead of thinking that it's opposed.
Exactly. Like, to the risk of repeating myself, like I feel like people of color have a need to heal this not feeling good in their identity, and so going to extremes. And so I've always felt like when looking at the world news, even when I was ill, like, can we just have balance, guys? Like, we have multiple identities, like it's okay, like calm down, And I kind of get why Jeff insists so much on, for example, me healing the fact that I'm Black and healing my culture in general, because without that, we're still going to experience in all of these countries like this extremism or even going secular or going super religious, as if we couldn't have, you know, everything in our identity at the same time. Yeah. Sage wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just saying that that's such a great point. It resonates across like many groups, like for LGBT people too, which we also were talking about with each other. Yeah, just like healing that feeling too of like not being seen as the exact same thing, or like yeah, like healing the feeling of rejection instead of just like, you know, acting out kind of against it, or like healing the feeling of like, oh, I'm neglected. Well, you give love and attention to yourself and you experience that in yourself, and then you won't feel the need to well, then you won't feel so oppressed by your society because you find that liberation within, you know? And yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's perfect actually. And it's definitely manifesting in a different way for LGBTQ people, but I like the fact that you brought up that it's the same healing about being seen and accepting yourself. We're definitely seeing that with Oprah's speeches about like how LGBTQ plus rights are still not grounding into society today. And, you know, in France, the fact that violence against LGBTQ people raised by 28% last year. And the last instance of that is that there was an association that called drag queens to read to kids in a local library, and far-right extremists, they showed up and just like, it was peaceful until that, and in the name of peace and status quo that they want to have, they showed up in the library and disturbed everything and kind of scared the kids and threatened everyone, and just like, it's so funny because like far extremist political people that probably have issues with the justice of harassing kids and women and more can go to the schools to talk and read something and have like extremist opinion out in the open, but not drag queens just reading a book, a children's book. So I'm not going to extend on like how unfair this is. I feel like the society has enough of that, but there's definitely some healing there. And yeah, we're feeling like it's time to stop, but there are still like triggers showing up and upsets showing up about like, well, we have not healed this completely. And I feel like the base message of this is we have not healed this completely. And it showed up in Oprah's speech. She did just one, sorry. And other things, but yeah, how do you guys feel about that?
There's something that Andrea raised that I think is still the core of the problem, is the fear of the unknown. But it's the extent of it is the fear of the other, the vilifying of the other. And we've seen it countless times. We've discussed it countless times. But it's always the sense of that if it's not similar or the same, it's bad or wrong. And we must have seen this play out throughout history, that humanity vilifies the other. It's like it literally still goes back to that sense of protecting your tribe at all costs and fighting against the other tribe because of a sense of scarcity. We have to, it's almost this feeling of we have to fight for resources and there's not enough for everybody. So we can't give freely and we can't share freely. It's like literally still that rudimentary sense of tribes competing for survival. And it's just playing out countless times over and over and over again. And that's why it stood out to me when you said there's still something around the core of the healing. And the core of the healing is literally this vilifying of the other. Because if we didn't vilify the other, we wouldn't have had to fight so hard for gender rights. We wouldn't have had to fight so hard for LGBTQ rights. We wouldn't have had to fight so hard for acceptance of racial rights and racial differences. It's all these differences that are literally, for lack of a better expression, scaring the crap out of people, and yet those differences really are actually inconsequential. And I think that's where the core of the issue is. It's this vilifying of the other. And as long as we see the other, we are always going to be skeptical of the other, and some will resort to more extreme measures to supposedly protect themselves against the other.
It's heavy, heavy conditioning, like layers upon layers of conditions.
Yeah, and that is true. And I feel like, you know, obviously, like LGBTQ people, like they're not doing anything wrong just by existing or even by sharing themselves with the explicit agenda of increasing social awareness of us, because that's what it's about, right? Like these drag queen story hours, they're about increasing awareness of LGBTQ people, normalizing it, and like just helping people have exposure and see the humanity of people. And also for the little kids who themselves might be part of the LGBTQ community, they can see like, an adult who's like living as their true selves and be inspired by that. But as long as somebody sees LGBTQ people as being, basically like as being wrong, like something's wrong with them, then of course they're not going to like that. And they're going to think, well, you're doing evil even if like they're doing nothing, but they're just reading a book to kids, but just being themselves. And there's nothing we can do about that except go into ourselves and find where we don't feel accepted and love ourselves there. Because like we can't, like all the like blustering in the world about the unfairness and the backwardness of others will never get us anywhere. And I completely get it though, because it is outrageous, but that's the point. Like the point of all of this anti-LGBTQ stuff is to garner outrage and to stir up a greater fight. And if to increase the grievance. And when there's more grievances, sometimes people get motivated to like vote and support, whichever side is saying we're aggrieved. And so, we have to love and accept ourselves. And in doing these things and in just being ourselves in the world, we have to give ourselves the acceptance and not seek it from anybody. Like, because that's the energy you want, like going into like your drag queen story hour or going into like wherever like you happen to be, is being like, I already accept myself and I'm just shining my light. And I know that just by being myself, I'm doing something. positive for the world, and I don't need you to accept me. I accept myself. And if you don't, I have compassion for you because it's uncomfortable to be that, like, yeah, what's the word? I don't know.
Out there? I don't know.
Bothered, yeah. Yeah. So
Oh,
that's how I feel about it. And yeah, I don't know. But do you think, well, I think Oprah making that speech though it is really kind of her. I think it is compassionate to do because it's extending like this lifeline of support out to the LGBT community. And a lot of the people in the community, they feel really alone. And like nobody supports them, you know? So that's really, really kind of her. And
you know what that all makes me think about? Spiritually, like this week, I find myself revisiting things that I felt that I had healed for good, like a few months back. And so, and we know that when it's at its ends with, like ego is making the most noise. And so it kind of feels like the last battle of this cycle. For some reason, like the drag queens, like I was like, oh, they're inviting drag queens to read books in France. Like that is not as common as you'd think. Like it's very new for us. And so I was like, wow, they're being accepted. And then ego is making a mess. But it doesn't like I feel like even when ego is making a mess, like what did the kids think? I think like the kids thought it was awesome. It was great. So love will always win, and that's the message. And it kind of feels like even when ego is making a lot of noise, like we're still upholding the boundaries. Like I think it's an underrated successful story for me, and Oprah's speech as well, because she's kind of with her own soul design, she's kind of helping in the last of this cycle to kind of make things peaceful. That's one way to see it. That's one perspective, but I definitely think that there's a component of it in there.
Yeah, I like what you said about the ego making noise when everything's kind of releasing. And it's surprising because when I read that either 50 or 500 anti-LGBT bills were trying to get passed in DC. And it's just surprising. I love how that's happening. But this week, there's trans awareness in DC public libraries. So what's going on in Congress and everything at the core, but in the outside, everyone's just like accepting and really trying to move forward in unconditional love. And like, even in the public libraries of DC, this is what's happening and there's awareness being brought. So yeah, I like that analogy that you were saying.
yeah, and one thing too, like in the article that was linked, like, so in the article about Oprah making the speech, there's another article linked and it said, well, in one survey it was saying even a majority of like Republicans in the US think that anti-LGBTQ bills are too, like they're making too much of a big deal out of it and that it's like political theater. And I'm like, man, like, dude, if you've even burnt out like Republicans, like if they're burnt out on all this like grandstanding and this like insanity, then like you should definitely reconsider your approach, you know? And I felt like that was cool because maybe people, like we've been talking a lot about how people's mental health got challenged by the pandemic and how people became more self-reflective sometimes with the pandemic. And I almost feel like all of this like crisis stuff has people burnt out and they're just like, why are we like freaking out about this? Now, not everyone is like that, but I thought that was interesting too.
So I like that you mentioned the mental health angle as well, because I think one of the things, if you tie in the mental health angle with the angle that Yoreen brought in around ego making a noise, I think that they're serving their purpose perfectly. They're serving their purpose perfectly, showing how ridiculous some of the shit actually is, so that they actually do encourage people to make new choices. So, you know, we might not appreciate that they are shitting the bed, but, you know, the bed is being shat and people know about it and people are choosing not to have a shat bed.
I was going to say something very similar, less shat words. But yeah, I feel like it's a good thing, you know, like sometimes you need the pressure and the opposition and the loudness, because I feel like it pushes you and it pushes people, society, to what they actually want. And I feel like this is kind of what's happening. Like all this progress that we're making in certain ways, I feel like is upheaving more areas that just like need some of that attention. And then it kind of relates to what you were saying, Granville, because I feel like when you vilify other people, like there's this constant fear and judgment of the unknown, the other. I feel like it also goes back to kind of like not claiming all parts of yourself and claiming all of who you are, because, you know, on a spiritual level, and we know from the teachings of union, we are all God's child. Like we are all one in that sense. And so in society, not accepting, you know, trans people, or not accepting, you know, in Turkey, like there's the conflict between Muslim and secularism. I feel like it all goes back to just learning how to, or choosing to claim yourself. And I feel like that's where humanity is right now, is just kind of reconciling all these parts so we can get closer to just being one. And the fact that we are kind of still dealing with like racism and all these things, I think it's kind of like what Yoreen was saying, like maybe it's just part of this, like the end of this cycle where it's just all this like noise and frustration, but it's leading to more unity and like a deeper understanding of just who we are as humans, you know, as a collective.
Is it a reach to kind of make a link with like the lessons that Elon Musk has been like experiencing with Twitter, and how he had to make that experience in order to place a new appointed CEO there, in order to manage the company better and focus on his other companies? I don't know if it's like kind of what is actually going on there, but it feels like it was kind of this spiritual pattern. You know, when you make a lot of money, like all of your, or at least when you're famous, all of your patterns are kind of like brought up, multiplied. So it kind of felt like a huge upheaval for him. I don't know if it was like a bad choice or not. I feel like it was a neutral choice to take over Twitter, whatever people say, but it was definitely a spiritual lesson, because like it always is, obviously.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that when he first took over Twitter, it was recommended that he appoint someone in that position. And maybe he was clinging to that role for a little bit just to see if he could balance it and see what he could bring to that table. But it was something that he upheaved and moved through to make the best of it. Now, whether she's the best candidate, I'm not quite sure. I think she was in NBC's company. And what Elon's going for is very, like, I would say, radical in his approach to Twitter and how he wants to revolutionize it. And whether his board and appointed people can keep up with that, we'll definitely have to see. I mean, I would love to see the changes that he's making. Some of them I don't know about, like buying the ticks to verify yourself. I'm not sure about, because now, you know, everyone can buy it and verify themselves. But yeah, I'm looking forward to see what he's trying to get at with Twitter and seeing the changes.
Okay, so we have reached our hour. I think it's an interesting view to just put all of those in the same frame, because you can just also from his perspective, I mean, there's also a little bit of ego at play. So there's a lot of ego being bruised at the moment and being asked to check itself. So it's going to be interesting to continue to explore all of these topics. But thank you everybody for the conversation today, and thank you to the people who have followed us. To anybody else who has not yet followed us, please do feel free to like and subscribe to our Church of Union YouTube channel, where you will find all our previous conversations, and we look forward to seeing all of you again next week. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.